The scissors sliced through Autumn Clark's honey blonde ponytail with a sickening crunch that echoed across the empty gymnasium, while Tyler Brennan's laughter bounced off the polished walls like a cruel symphony. What started as another day of harmless hazing for the principal's son would end with him sobbing on his knees, begging for mercy in front of the entire school. Nobody knew that the quiet transfer student from Oregon had been training for this moment her entire life, and Tyler Brennan was about to learn why you should never underestimate the girl whose father runs elite military boot camps for a living. But before we dive into how one 17-year-old turned the tables on Riverside High's most untouchable bully, drop a comment below and tell us about a time when you stood up to someone who thought they had all the power. Sometimes the most powerful stories come from the most unexpected voices, and your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Riverside High School in Millbrook, Colorado, sat like a fortress against the Rocky Mountain backdrop, its red brick walls hiding secrets that would make parents pack up and move towns if they knew the truth. The school had a reputation for excellence championship football teams, Ivy League acceptance rates, and a principal who'd been featured in Educational Leadership magazine 3 times. What the glossy brochures didn't mention was the carefully maintained hierarchy that kept certain families' children untouchable, no matter what they did behind closed doors. Autumn Clark had arrived at Riverside exactly 72 hours ago, her Toyota Camry loaded with everything she owned after her father's latest military contract had uprooted their family once again. At 17, she'd attended 8 different high schools across 4 states, each move teaching her new survival skills that most teenagers never needed to learn. She was 5'6" with the kind of athletic build that came from years of mandatory dawn runs with her father, sharp green eyes that missed nothing, and honey blonde hair that fell in waves past her shoulder share that had never been cut by anyone except her mother's careful hands. Her father, Colonel James Clark, ran specialized training programs for military personnel transitioning to civilian security work. His methods were legendary in certain circles: psychological resilience training, tactical thinking under pressure, and something he called controlled escalation, teaching people how to turn their opponent's aggression against them. Autumn had been his unofficial test subject since she was 12, learning techniques that no high school guidance counselor would ever put on a college application. But none of that mattered at Riverside, where power came from last names and bank account balances, not actual strength or intelligence. Tyler Brennan ruled Riverside High with the casual cruelty that came from knowing consequences were for other people. As the only son of Principal Margaret Brennan, he'd been groomed since kindergarten to see the school as his personal kingdom. 6'3" with quarterback shoulders and his mother's calculating blue eyes, Tyler had perfected the art of inflicting maximum humiliation while maintaining plausible deniability. His crew Mason Webb, Cole Martinez, and Derek Stoneformed, a pack of legacy students whose families' donations had funded the new science wing, the championship football field, and the principal's salary raises for the past decade. Tyler's specialty was what he called welcome parties for new students, carefully orchestrated humiliation rituals designed to establish social order from day one. He'd driven 3 transfer students to request immediate transfers in the past 2 years, each incident buried under a mountain of "boys will be boys" explanations and hefty donations to the school's building fund. The administration had learned not to ask too many questions when Tyler's victims suddenly developed mysterious family emergencies that required immediate relocation. The morning of Thursday, October 19th, began like any other day in Tyler's kingdom. He'd arrived at school in his lifted Chevy Silverado graduation gift from his grandfather's construction empire and held court in the senior parking lot while underclassmen hurried past with averted eyes. First period AP Government had been canceled due to a scheduling conflict, which everyone knew meant Coach Davidson was hungover again. This left Tyler with an unexpected free period and a dangerous combination of boredom and opportunity. "New girls in third period gym," Mason reported, scrolling through his phone with the efficiency of a military intelligence officer. Autumn something moved here from Oregon. His father owned the largest car dealership in 3 counties, which meant Mason had access to school records through his mother's part-time job in the attendance office. Oregon? Tyler's lips curved into the predatory smile that had terrified Riverside students for 4 years. Tree hugger territory. Probably thinks she can save the whales or some liberal garbage. He cracked his knuckles, a sound that made freshmen scatter like startled birds. Time for a proper Colorado welcome. Cole Martinez, whose family had built their fortune in oil and gas, laughed with the nervous energy of someone who'd learned that staying in Tyler's good graces required enthusiastic participation in his cruelties. What's the plan? Boss? Same as always, Tyler said, his voice carrying the casual confidence of someone who'd never faced a consequence he couldn't buy his way out of. Find out what she values most, then take it away. But this time, we're going bigger. I'm thinking something that'll make the rounds on social media, really cement our message about how things work around here. Derek Stone, son of a federal judge, pulled out his phone with practiced efficiency. I'll get everything recorded. Multiple angles. Professional quality. My dad says documentation is key to controlling the narrative afterward. They moved through the halls like sharks, sensing blood in the water, their expensive sneakers silent on the polished floors that their family's tax dollars had installed. Students pressed themselves against lockers as they passed, understanding instinctively that when Tyler Brennan was hunting, everyone else became potential collateral damage. The gymnasium at Riverside High was a monument to athletic excellence and financial excess. The gleaming hardwood floors bore the school's mascota golden eagle, with wings spread wide embedded in the center circle, with artistic precision that had cost more than most families' annual income. Retractable bleachers lined both sides, capable of seating 800 screaming fans during basketball season. The walls displayed championship banners going back 30 years, a testament to what money and influence could accomplish when properly applied. Autumn had arrived early for third period physical education, a habit developed through years of being the new kid who needed extra time to figure out basic logistics like locker combinations and uniform requirements. She wore the standard-issue Riverside Gym, closed navy blue shorts, and a gold t-shirt emblazoned with the Eagle logo but somehow made the generic uniform look purposeful rather than mandatory. Her honey blonde hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail secured with a black elastic band, practical and neat. She was stretching near the far wall when Tyler and his crew entered the gymnasium with the swagger of conquering heroes returning from battle. Their timing was perfect. Coach Henderson was dealing with a scheduling conflict in his office, leaving the gym under the supervision of student aide Rebecca Chen, a junior who'd learned that self-preservation meant looking the other way. When Tyler decided to establish dominance, well, Tyler announced, his voice echoing across the empty space with theatrical projection. What do we have here? Fresh meat? Autumn looked up from her hamstring stretch, taking in the four approaching figures with the kind of calm assessment her father had drilled into her since childhood. She recognized the pack dynamics immediately alpha predator flanked by eager followers, hunting in familiar territory where they held every advantage. Her green eyes moved methodically from face to face, cataloging details with military precision. Tyler's expensive haircut and designer athletic wear, Mason's nervous energy and phone already recording, Cole's artificial bravado, masking, genuine uncertainty, Derek's calculating expression and strategically positioned backup camera. You're the new girl, Tyler continued, stopping just inside her personal space bubble with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no. Autumn, right? Cute name. Very. Natural. That's me, Autumn replied, her voice steady and unremarkable. She'd learned years ago that showing fear or defiance too early only escalated situations before she'd had time to assess all variables. You must be Tyler. I've heard about you. Tyler's smile widened, interpreting her calm response as submission rather than strategy. All good things, I hope. I like to think of myself as Riverside's unofficial welcome committee, making sure new students understand how things work around here. How thoughtful, Autumn said, straightening to her full height. Eaten at 5'6", she seemed somehow larger than her physical dimensions, carrying herself with the kind of presence that came from years of standing at attention during her father's inspection drills. Mason giggled nervously, already filming as Tyler began to circle Autumn like a predator sizing up prey. She's got spirit. Boss, this should be fun. Spirit's good, Tyler agreed, reaching out to touch Autumn's ponytail with proprietary familiarity, but too much spirit can be a problem. Lucky for you, he specialized in attitude adjustments. The moment his fingers made contact with her hair, Autumn's entire demeanor shifted. Not visibly, her expression remained neutral. Her posture relaxed, but something fundamental changed in the air around her. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. The first rule of tactical engagement is patience. Let your opponent reveal their intentions before you reveal your capabilities. I appreciate the offer, Autumn said, stepping back just far enough to break contact while maintaining eye contact. But I'm pretty comfortable with my attitude as it is. Tyler's smile faltered for just a moment before returning with renewed intensity. Challenge accepted. He'd broken dozens of transfer students with this exact approach: public humiliation, followed by private consequences that taught them to keep their mouths shut. The formula had never failed him. See? That's exactly what I'm talking about, Tyler said, pulling a pair of scissors from his gym bag with theatrical flourish. The metal gleamed under the fluorescent lights like a prop from a horror movie. Too much pride for someone in your position? But don't worry, Uncle Tyler's got just the cure. The scissors had been Cole's contribution to the plan. Liberated from the art room during second period, with the kind of casual theft that their social status made invisible. They were professional-grade fabric shears, 7 inches of surgical steel designed to cut through heavy materials with minimal effort. In Tyler's hands, they became a symbol of his absolute power over anyone who dared to challenge Riverside's established order. You can't be serious, Rebecca Chen whispered from her position near the equipment room, her face pale with the realization that she was about to witness something that would require official reporting and unofficial forgetting. Dead serious, Tyler replied, advancing on Autumn with the scissors held high enough for his crew's cameras to capture every angle. New girl here needs to understand that attitude problems have consequences. And nothing teaches humility quite like a good old-fashioned haircut. Autumn's mind raced through tactical options with computer-like efficiency. The gymnasium had 4 exits, but Tyler's positioning blocked the main doors while his crew controlled the sightlines to the other 3. Her phone was in her gym bag 20 feet away, too far to reach without turning her back on an armed opponent. Coach Henderson's office was soundproofed for privacy during disciplinary meetings, meaning screaming wouldn't bring help. But her father hadn't raised a daughter who needed rescuing. You know, Autumn said conversationally, my dad always told me that people who need weapons to feel powerful usually aren't very powerful to begin with. Tyler's face flushed red at the implication, his grip tightening on the scissors until his knuckles showed white. Your daddy's not here to protect you now, sweetheart. Time to learn how the real world works. Actually, Autumn replied, her voice carrying a new edge that made Mason's camera wobble slightly. I think you're about to learn that lesson yourself. She moved with the fluid precision of years of tactical training, her body flowing into a defensive stance so naturally that Tyler almost missed the transition. Her weight shifted to the balls of her feet, her hands rising to a ready position that looked casual, but positioned her fingers for maximum leverage against an attacker with a bladed weapon. What are you? Tyler began, then lunged forward with the scissors aimed at her ponytail. What happened next would be analyzed frame by frame in the video footage that Mason and Derek captured, though neither boy fully understood what they'd recorded until much later. Autumn's left hand deflected Tyler's wrist with minimal force, redirecting his momentum, while her right hand closed around his forearm with the kind of grip that suggested serious martial arts training. For a split second, she held him in perfect balance. His own aggression turned against him, the scissors trapped uselessly in his extended hand. Then she let physics take over. Tyler stumbled forward, his expensive athletic shoes finding no purchase on the polished gymnasium floor. The scissors flew from his grasp, clattering across the hardwood with a sound like breaking bones. He crashed into the wall with enough force to knock down 2 championship banners, his shoulders taking the impact that his pride couldn't absorb. Holy shit, Derek breathed, his camera capturing Tyler's humiliation in high-definition detail. Mason kept filming with shaking hands, his nervous giggle replaced by shocked silence as he watched the social order of Riverside High School crack like ice on a frozen pond. Tyler pushed himself off the wall, his face cycling through emotions too rapidly for his teenage brain to process. Shock gave way to rage. Rage to embarrassment. Embarrassment to the kind of desperate fury that came from having his invincibility shattered in front of witnesses with cameras. You're dead, he snarled, spitting blood from where he'd bitten his tongue during the impact. "Do you have any idea who I am? Who my mother is?" "I know exactly who you are," Autumn replied, bending to pick up the scissors with calm deliberation. She held them for a moment, testing their weight and balance with professional interest. "You're a spoiled brat who's never been told no in his entire life. You're a coward who needs weapons and friends to feel strong. And you're about to learn what happens when you mess with someone who actually knows how to fight back." Cole Martinez backed toward the exit with the survival instincts that oil money couldn't buy. "Tyler, man, maybe we should." "Shoot up," Tyler roared, charging at Autumn with the kind of wild aggression that tactical training was specifically designed to counter. This time, Autumn didn't hold back. Her father's lessons had covered every scenario: larger opponents, multiple attackers, confined spaces, weapon retention, psychological warfare. Tyler Brennan was bigger, stronger, and angrier than she was. He was also completely untrained, emotionally compromised, and fighting on her terms now. She sidestepped his charge with matador-like precision, using his momentum to send him crashing into the retractable bleachers with a sound like thunder. The metal framework shuddered under the impact, and several students in the hallway outside stopped to stare through the gymnasium windows. Tyler bounced off the bleachers and stumbled to his feet, his expensive gym clothes torn and his quarterback confidence cracking like a broken facade. Blood trickled from his nose where it had connected with a metal support beam, and his left shoulder hung at an odd angle that suggested real injury. "Stop," Rebecca Chen pleaded from her position near the door, her student aid authority meaningless in the face of actual violence. "Please, just stop." But Tyler was beyond reason now, driven by the kind of desperate fury that came from watching his entire world collapse in real time. He'd built his identity on being untouchable, unbeatable, unstoppable. Autumn Clark was systematically dismantling every assumption he'd ever made about power and control. "I'll destroy you," he gasped, struggling to breathe through his damaged nose. "I'll destroy your family. I'll make sure you never set foot in another school anywhere in this country." Autumn held up the scissors, examining their edges with the kind of professional interest that sent chills down Mason's spine. "You know what? You're right about one thing. This is definitely going to be memorable." She walked to where her gym bag sat against the wall, her movements unhurried and deliberate while Tyler's crew watched in fascinated horror. From the bag, she pulled out her phone, not to call for help, but to activate an app that her father had insisted she install on the first day of every new school. "Colorado is a one-party consent state for recording," she announced conversationally, her finger hovering over the screen, "which means I can legally record any conversation I'm part of without telling the other participants, including conversations where someone threatens my family." Tyler's face went pale as the implications sank in. "You can't. Actually, I can. And I just did." Autumn held up her phone, showing the recording that had captured every threat, every admission of guilt, every moment of violence from the past 10 minutes. "But here's the really interesting part. My dad didn't just teach me how to defend myself. He taught me how to document everything for maximum legal impact." She gestured toward Mason and Derek, both still filming with phones that had captured angles Tyler definitely didn't want preserved. "Between their footage and my audio, I'd say we have a pretty compelling case for assault, battery, threatening behavior, and conspiracy to commit bodily harm. Plus, there's the whole thing about you being the principal's son, which adds some really interesting Title IX implications about institutional bias and administrative cover-ups." Mason lowered his phone with shaking hands, the reality of his situation finally penetrating his trust fund-addled brain. "Tyler, dude, we need to delete this. We need to." "Too late," Autumn said cheerfully. "Everything's already been uploaded to cloud storage with automatic forwarding to my dad's email, my lawyer's office, and a few other interested parties. Military families learn to prepare for contingencies." Tyler stared at her with growing horror as the full scope of his miscalculation became clear. He'd attacked someone who was not only capable of defending herself, but who'd been preparing for exactly this scenario her entire life. Every threat he'd made, every violent act he'd committed, every assumption of immunity he'd relied on, all of it had been carefully documented by someone who understood how to use evidence as a weapon more devastating than any physical force. "What do you want?" he whispered, his voice cracking with the weight of his crumbling world. Autumn smiled for the first time since entering the gymnasium. And it was not a pleasant expression. "I want you to understand something very important. Tyler, you picked the wrong girl to mess with. And now you're going to learn what real consequences feel like." The gymnasium doors burst open with enough force to make everyone jump, and Coach Henderson stormed in with the kind of righteous fury that suggested he'd heard enough through his supposedly soundproof office walls to understand the situation. Behind him came Assistant Principal Williams, Security Guard Morrison, and most terrifyingly, for Tyler Principal Margaret Brennan herself. Margaret Brennan was 54 years old, 5'8", and built like a linebacker who'd traded her jersey for power suits and administrative authority. She'd clawed her way up from substitute teacher to principal through 3 decades of political maneuvering, strategic alliances, and carefully managed scandals. Her steel-gray hair was pulled back in a bun that could cut glass, and her blue eyes held the kind of cold calculation that had made grown school board members weep during budget meetings. She was also Tyler's mother, which meant she'd spent 17 years watching her son's behavior escalate while convincing herself that boys would be boys and that his victims probably deserved whatever happened to them. But walking into that gymnasium, seeing her son bloodied and defeated while a teenage girl held evidence of his crimes, Margaret Brennan felt the foundations of her carefully constructed world beginning to crumble. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice echoing off the walls with administrative authority. Autumn stepped forward, her posture respectful, but her green eyes blazing with the kind of controlled fury that her father would have recognized immediately. "Principal Brennan, I'm Autumn Clark. I'm new here, and your son just attempted to assault me with a weapon while his friends filmed it for entertainment." She held up her phone, the recording still running, capturing every word for posterity. "Everything's been documented, and copies have already been sent to appropriate authorities. I thought you should know before the police arrive." Margaret Brennan's face went through several shades of red before settling on a mottled purple that clashed with her navy blazer. "Young lady, I don't know what kind of school you came from, but at Riverside High, we don't tolerate false accusations against our students." "Good thing these aren't false accusations, then," Autumn replied, to her voice, carrying the kind of respectful insubordination that had been driving authority figures crazy for generations. "Would you like to see the video footage? Your son was very thorough about documenting his crimes." Tyler struggled to his feet, blood still trickling from his nose, and his left arm hanging uselessly at his side. "Mom, she attacked me. She's crazy." Tyler, the single word from his mother carried enough venom to stop him mid-sentence. Margaret Brennan had built her career on reading situations and understanding when damage control was more important than family loyalty. One look at the phones, the evidence, and her son's obvious injuries told her everything she needed to know about how this would play out in the court of public opinion. "Everyone out?" she commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "Now, except you, Miss Clark, we need to talk." As the gymnasium emptied, Tyler limping out, supported by his increasingly nervous crew, Coach Henderson muttering about paperwork and liability, Assistant Principal Williams already pulling out his phone to call the district office, Autumn found herself alone with the most powerful person at Riverside High School. Margaret Brennan waited until the last echo of footsteps had faded before speaking, her voice dropping to the kind of conversational tone that somehow carried more menace than shouting. "Miss Clark, I'm going to be very clear about your options here. Riverside High School has a reputation to maintain. My son has a future to protect. You've been here exactly 3 days. You have no friends, no support system, no local connections. It would be very easy for you to simply disappear, transfer to another school, another state, perhaps start fresh somewhere else where this unfortunate misunderstanding could be forgotten." Autumn listened with the patient attention her father had taught her to show when opponents revealed their strategies. When the principal finished, she nodded thoughtfully. "That's a very generous offer, Principal Brennan. Unfortunately, I'm not interested in running away from bullies. My family has a different approach to dealing with people who think power makes them untouchable. She pulled out her phone again, scrolling to a contact that made Margaret Brennan's blood turn to ice water in her veins. Maybe I should introduce you to my father, Colonel James Clark, United States Army. Currently contracted with the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights to investigate institutional bias in disciplinary procedures at schools receiving federal funding. He's been looking for a good test case to demonstrate how administrative corruption enables systematic harassment of vulnerable students. The color drained from Margaret Brennan's face as the implications crashed over her like a tsunami. A federal investigation would mean audits, interviews, subpoenas, media attention. Every decision she'd made, every cover-up she'd orchestrated, every time she'd protected, Tyler and his crew would be examined under a microscope by people with badges and legal authority. "You can't prove anything," she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. "Actually, I can prove everything," Autumn replied, her finger hovering over her father's contact information, 3 years of documented incidents, financial records showing how donations influence disciplinary decisions, email chains discussing strategies for silencing victims, security footage that was supposed to be destroyed but somehow found its way into federal evidence storage. She looked directly into Margaret Brennan's eyes, and for a moment the principal saw not a 17-year-old girl, but a trained operative who'd been planning this confrontation since the moment she'd walked through Riverside's doors. "The question isn't whether you're going down, Principal Brennan. The question is, how many people you're taking with you, because in about 30 seconds, I'm going to call my father and tell him that Riverside High School is exactly the kind of institutionally corrupt environment his investigation was designed to target." Margaret Brennan stared at the phone in Autumn's hands, understanding with crystalline clarity that her career, her reputation, and her son's future hung in the balance of whatever happened next. Outside the gymnasium, sirens were beginning to wail in the distance, growing closer with each passing second. Part 2. The sirens reached their crescendo as 3 police cruisers and an ambulance pulled into Riverside High's circular drive, their flashing red and blue lights painting the brick facade in colors that would forever change how the community viewed their prestigious institution. Through the gymnasium windows, Autumn watched Principal Brennan's face cycle through the 5 stages of grief at breakneck speed, denial crumbling into anger. Anger, dissolving into bargaining. Bargaining, giving way to depression, and finally settling into a hollow-eyed acceptance that her 30-year career was about to end in handcuffs and headlines. "Miss Clark," Margaret Brennan said, her voice barely above a whisper, "surely we can reach some kind of understanding. Tyler's just a boy. He made a mistake. Boys his age should know better than to assault their classmates with weapons." Autumn interrupted, her fingers still poised over her father's contact. "And administrators your age should know better than to enable systematic harassment for the sake of donation checks." The gymnasium doors exploded inward again, this time admitting Sergeant Maria Santos of the Millbrook Police Department, followed by 2 younger officers and a paramedic team. Santos was 43 years old, built like a former athlete who'd traded her running shoes for tactical boots, with sharp dark eyes that had seen enough teenage violence to recognize the real perpetrators from the manufactured victims. "Someone called in an assault with a weapon?" Santos announced, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made even principals stand straighter. "Where's the victim?" "That would be me," Autumn said, stepping forward with the kind of calm confidence that immediately caught the sergeant's attention. Most assault victims were shaking, crying, or angry. This girl looked like she was conducting a business meeting. "And the perpetrator?" "Tyler Brennan," Autumn replied, gesturing toward the doors where Tyler was attempting to sneak out with his injured shoulder and wounded pride. "Principal Brennan's son. He attacked me with scissors while his friends filmed it for entertainment." Sergeant Santos's eyebrows rose slightly. She'd been called to Riverside High exactly 7 times in the past 3 years, each incident involving Tyler Brennan, and each report mysteriously disappearing into administrative limbo after a phone call from someone with more influence than sense. "Ma'am?" Officer Patterson called from the doorway. "We've got the alleged perpetrator trying to leave the premises. Should we detain him?" "Absolutely," Santos replied, then turned back to Autumn. "Miss Clark, I'm going to need to see those recordings you mentioned on the phone." Margaret Brennan's face went white. "Recordings? What recordings? The ones where your son threatened to destroy my family, Autumn said conversationally, pulling up the audio file on her phone. Colorado's a one-party consent state, so everything he said is legally admissible. Would you like to hear the part where he bragged about having administrative protection? Or should we skip straight to the section where he detailed his plans to assault me? The color drained from Margaret Brennan's face so rapidly that the paramedic automatically reached for his blood pressure cuff. In 30 years of educational administration, she'd perfected the art of plausible deniability, but audio recordings of criminal conspiracy were considerably harder to explain away than tearful accusations from traumatized teenagers. Principal Brennan, Sergeant Santos said, her voice taking on the formal tone that preceded Miranda rights, I think we need to have a conversation about your knowledge of your son's behavioral patterns and any institutional policies that might have enabled this incident. Through the windows, Autumn could see Tyler being placed in the back of a police cruiser, his expensive athletic wear torn and bloodied, his quarterback confidence replaced by the kind of shocked disbelief that came from finally meeting consequences he couldn't buy his way out of. Mason Webb was crying openly as Officer Martinez collected his phone for evidence, while Cole Martinez and Derek Stone stood against the wall with their hands visible, their faces pale, with the realization that their social media documentation had just become prosecution evidence. Miss Clark, Santos continued, I'm going to need detailed statements about everything that happened here. But first, are you injured? Do you need medical attention? I'm fine, Autumn replied, then paused thoughtfully. Though I should mention that Tyler's shoulder looked dislocated when he hit the bleachers. He might need an X-ray. The paramedic looked up from his equipment with professional interest. You have medical training? My father's military. He taught me basic trauma assessment. Autumn's voice carried just enough casual authority to make everyone present recalculate their assumptions about who she was and where she'd come from. Outside, a black Ford Explorer with government plates pulled into the faculty parking lot, and Autumn smiled for the first time since the confrontation began. Actually, Sergeant Santos, I think you're about to meet someone who can provide some additional context about this situation. Colonel James Clark emerged from the Explorer like a force of nature contained in a perfectly pressed business suit. At 6'4" with iron gray hair and the kind of bearing that made strangers automatically assume he was in charge of whatever room he entered. He moved across the parking lot with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to fixing problems that other people couldn't solve. Behind him came a woman in a navy blazer whose Department of Education credentials gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, followed by a man in an FBI windbreaker who looked like he'd been waiting his entire career for a case exactly like this one. That's my father, Autumn explained unnecessarily as the gymnasium doors opened to admit the federal cavalry. I texted him about 20 minutes ago. He's very responsive when people threaten his family. Colonel Clark's eyes swept the gymnasium with tactical precision, taking in his daughter's calm demeanor. The scattered championship banners, the blood on the floor, and the shell-shocked expression of a principal who just realized that her comfortable world of influence and immunity had evaporated like morning mist. Autumn, he said, his voice carrying the kind of controlled intensity that made veteran sergeants snap to attention. Status report. Mission accomplished. Sire. Autumn replied with just enough formality to make it clear that this conversation had been planned. Target identified. Evidence collected. Local authorities notified. The administration appears ready to cooperate fully with federal oversight. Sergeant Santos looked between father and daughter with growing understanding. Colonel Clark, I presume? Your daughter called in the assault. She did indeed, Clark replied, extending his hand with the kind of firm grip that conveyed both respect and subtle warning. And I understand there may be some institutional patterns worth investigating. Agent Morrison here specializes in educational civil rights violations, while Miss Rodriguez from the Department of Education handles systemic compliance issues. Agent Morrison stepped forward, his badge visible, and his expression suggesting that Christmas had come early for federal investigators looking to make their careers on high-profile corruption cases. Principal Brennan, we're going to need to examine your disciplinary records, financial documents, and administrative correspondence for the past 5 years. You have the right to have an attorney present during questioning. Margaret Brennan's legs gave out, and she collapsed into a plastic chair with the grace of a controlled demolition, 3 decades of careful career building, strategic networking, and administrative empire building had just become evidence in a federal investigation that would make headlines from Denver to Washington. "This is impossible," she whispered. People can't just. Families like ours don't." "Ma'am." "Miss," Rodriguez interrupted gently, "families like yours are exactly why oversight exists. When institutional power protects individual bad actors, federal intervention becomes necessary to protect the civil rights of students." Colonel Clark moved to his daughter's side, his expression softening just enough to remind everyone present that beneath the tactical precision and federal authority, he was a father who just watched his child handle a dangerous situation with exactly the kind of competence he'd spent years teaching her. "You handled this well?" he said quietly, his voice carrying pride that made Autumn's controlled facade crack just slightly. "Textbook documentation. Perfect escalation protocole. Excellent witness management. Your mother would be proud." For just a moment, Autumn allowed herself to be 17 again, leaning into her father's solid presence, while the adrenaline of the past hour finally began to fade. "I recorded everything, just like you taught me. Audio, video, witness statements. It's all admissible." "I know it is," Clark replied, then looked directly at Principal Brennan. "Ma'am, my daughter has been attending schools on military bases and in civilian districts for 8 years. I've seen every kind of institutional bias, administrative corruption, and systematic harassment that supposedly civilized educators can devise. What happened here today wasn't an isolated incident, it was the inevitable result of a culture that values donations over student safety." He pulled out his phone, scrolling through files with practiced efficiency. "I have documentation of 17 separate incidents at Riverside High over the past 3 years. Assaults that were reclassified as accidents, sexual harassment that became mutual misunderstandings, systematic targeting of scholarship students and minorities that somehow never made it into official reports." Agent Morrison's eyes lit up with prosecutorial enthusiasm. "Colonel Clark, would you be willing to share that documentation with our investigation?" "Already done," Clark replied. "Everything's been uploaded to your secure servers, along with analysis showing correlation patterns between family donation levels and disciplinary outcomes. The Department of Education has enough evidence to trigger a full Title IX investigation, while the FBI has sufficient grounds for RICO charges if the financial corruption runs as deep as preliminary evidence suggests." The gymnasium had transformed from a site of teenage violence into a federal crime scene, complete with evidence bags, digital forensics equipment, and the kind of methodical documentation that would ensure Tyler Brennan's assault conviction was just the opening act in a much larger legal drama. Sergeant Santos finished collecting Tyler's crew for formal statements, each boy now accompanied by hastily summoned parents whose expensive lawyers were already calculating billable hours and political damage control strategies. Mason Webb's father had arrived first, his car dealership empire suddenly feeling very small compared to federal investigation machinery. Cole Martinez's family oil money meant nothing to investigators who'd made careers prosecuting white-collar crime. Derek Stone's federal judge father was maintaining careful distance, understanding that judicial ethics required him to avoid any appearance of interference in a case that might eventually reach his courtroom, but it was Tyler himself who provided the investigation's most valuable evidence, his injury requiring transport to Millbrook General Hospital, where a combination of pain medication and teenage stupidity led him to confess everything to a nurse who turned out to be a mandatory reporter with excellent documentation skills. By 6 o'clock that evening, the story had broken on every major Colorado news outlet. Principal's son arrested in assault at elite high school led the Denver Post's website, while Channel 7 News ran a segment titled, "Federal Investigation Triggered by Teenage Violence at Riverside High." Social media exploded with the kind of righteous fury that turned local scandals into national conversations about privilege, accountability, and institutional corruption. 3 weeks later, Autumn Clark stood at the podium in Riverside High's auditorium, addressing a packed assembly that included students, parents, school board members, and enough media representatives to fill the first 2 rows. The auditorium itself had been renovated since the scandal broke. A new leadership had decided that transparent governance required transparent facilities without hidden cameras or soundproof offices where inconvenient truths could be buried. Interim Principal Johnson had asked Autumn to speak about her experience, hoping that student testimony might help heal a community fractured by revelations of systematic corruption. The request had surprised. Most administrators preferred their scandals handled quietly, without teenage witnesses providing uncomfortable reminders of institutional failure. But Dr. Johnson was different from his predecessor in every way that mattered. Hired from outside the Colorado education establishment, specifically because he had no connections to Riverside's old power structure, he'd made transparency his first priority and student safety his ultimate goal. 3 weeks ago, Autumn began, her voice carrying easily across the auditorium without need for amplification. I was the new girl, the outsider, the scholarship kid who didn't understand how things worked at Riverside High, and I was told, both directly and indirectly, that my job was to be grateful for the opportunity to attend such a prestigious institution. Regardless of how I was treated by students whose families had more money and influence than mine. She paused, looking out at faces that reflected the full spectrum of Riverside's social hierarchy, from scholarship students who'd never felt safe enough to speak up, to legacy students whose donation-funded futures had evaporated along with their parents' immunity, to faculty members who'd spent years enabling systematic harassment because challenging it meant career suicide. But here's what I learned from my father, who spent his career training people to protect others. Institutions are only as strong as their willingness to defend their most vulnerable members. Schools that protect bullies create cultures of fear. Administrators who prioritize donations over student safety become accomplices to systematic abuse. And communities that allow power to substitute for accountability inevitably discover that corruption spreads like cancer until nothing healthy remains. In the audience, several former Tyler Brennan victims wiped away tears as they heard their experiences validated for the first time. Ashley Martinez, whose sexual assault complaint had been buried 2 years ago, felt something like closure as she watched federal investigators collect evidence that would finally give her justice. Marcus Thompson, whose accidental fall down the stairs had left him with permanent back injuries, finally understood that he hadn't been crazy to suspect administrative cover-ups. The good news, Autumn continued, is that change is possible. Tyler Brennan is currently serving 6 months in juvenile detention while awaiting trial on multiple felony charges. Principal Brennan has been terminated and is facing federal charges for conspiracy and civil rights violations. The school board has been restructured to include independent oversight and student representation. And most importantly, Riverside High has implemented policies that prioritize student safety over donor satisfaction. She looked directly at the camera crew from Channel 7, understanding that her words would reach far beyond Riverside's insular community. To every student watching this who's been told to stay quiet, to be grateful for abuse, to accept systematic harassment as the price of opportunity, you don't have to. Document everything. Report to multiple authorities simultaneously. Find adults who will listen and advocates who will fight. And remember that bullies only win when good people do nothing. The applause that followed was long and genuine, led by students who'd lived in fear for years, and sustained by parents who'd finally understood the true cost of their community's culture of complicity. After the assembly, Autumn found herself surrounded by younger students asking for advice, sharing their own stories, and requesting contact information for federal investigators still building cases against other corrupted institutions. She spent 2 hours in the hallway, her father waiting patiently while she helped other teenagers understand their rights and options. "Ready to go home?" Colonel Clark asked when the last student had been reassured and the final phone number exchanged. "Almost." Autumn replied, "There's one more thing I need to do." She led him to the gymnasium where everything had started, now returned to its original purpose of athletic excellence rather than serving as a venue for systematic humiliation. The championship banners had been rehung, the floors repolished, and new security cameras installed to ensure that future incidents would be immediately visible to oversight authorities. Standing in the center of the court where Tyler Brennan had tried to cut her down to size, Autumn pulled out her phone and scrolled to a video message that had arrived that morning. Tyler's face appeared on the screen, pale and drawn from his time in juvenile detention, his expensive haircut replaced by institutional uniformity. "Autumn," the recorded Tyler said, his voice cracking with emotion that couldn't be manufactured. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I know saying sorry doesn't undo what I did to you or all the other people I hurt over the years. But I wanted you to know that I'm getting help. Real help. Therapy, and anger management, and classes about empathy and respect. My counselor says I need to understand why I thought I had the right to hurt people. And honestly, I'm starting to realize I never had any real reason except that I could get away with it." He paused, looking directly into the camera with eyes that finally reflected genuine remorse rather than calculated manipulation. "You could have really hurt me that day. You had every right to, but you didn't. You chose to document everything and let the system work instead of getting revenge. That taught me more about real strength than anything my dad ever told me about power and influence." The video ended with Tyler promising to make amends to every victim he could identify, his juvenile record ensuring that his crimes would follow him long enough to prevent him from simply buying his way back into positions where he could hurt others. "He'll be okay," Colonel Clark said quietly, recognizing the signs of genuine rehabilitation in Tyler's demeanor. "Some people need to lose everything before they can learn to value what matters." "I know," Autumn replied, deleting the video with the finality of someone ready to move forward. "My work here is done." 6 months later, Autumn Clark graduated valedictorian from Riverside High School, her speech focusing on the difference between earned respect and inherited privilege. She'd been accepted to Stanford, West Point, and Harvard, but had chosen the Air Force Academy, following her father's advice that real leadership required understanding service before command. Tyler Brennan graduated from juvenile detention with his GED and immediate enrollment in a therapeutic boarding school that specialized in rehabilitating privileged young men who'd never learned accountability. His father's business empire had survived federal investigation, but Richard Brennan himself had lost custody and visitation rights pending completion of his own court-mandated therapy program. Margaret Brennan pled guilty to federal civil rights violations and conspiracy charges, receiving 18 months in minimum security prison and permanent disbarment from educational administration. Her cooperation with ongoing investigations had helped prosecutors build cases against corruption networks in 17 other school districts, and Riverside High School became a model for institutional transparency, student protection, and administrative accountability, proof that even the most entrenched cultures of privilege and immunity could be reformed when good people refuse to accept systematic injustice as inevitable. The last video in Autumn's phone gallery showed her standing at the podium during graduation, her honey blonde hair now styled in a professional bob that she'd chosen herself, addressing a crowd that included federal investigators, reformed administrators, and hundreds of students who'd learned that courage was contagious and justice was possible. Change starts with one person refusing to accept unacceptable behavior, she told the graduates. It spreads when institutions choose accountability over convenience, and it becomes permanent when communities decide that protecting the vulnerable matters more than preserving the comfortable. As she walked across the stage to receive her diploma, Autumn Clark Heath, girl they'd tried to cut down to sizes, stood tall in the knowledge that sometimes the best revenge wasn't revenge at all, but the simple act of refusing to be silenced, documenting everything, and trusting that truth, properly presented, could topple any corrupt system built on lies. The applause that followed her across that stage carried the voices of every student who'd ever been told to stay quiet, every victim who'd been dismissed, and every future teenager who would attend a safer school because one girl had decided that enough was enough